Hello, good day, and welcome back to my channel. So today we'll be looking at Colossians chapter 2 verses 16 to 17, and we will be dealing with specifically food or meat. Now, I had done a 3-part series already on the law and the covenants, and I had touched a number of things from Colossians chapter 2. I did a study on what did Jesus bring to the cross, right? And from that video, I touched a number of things from Colossians chapter 2. I looked at Ephesians 2 and Colossians chapter 2. And I showed that if in the book of Ephesians chapter 2, it tells us that the commandment containing ordinances had to be done away, for they cause a separation between Jews and Gentiles, right? And I showed from Colossians chapter 2 which commandments those were, right? And I had dealt with circumcision, I had dealt with new moon, and the festival or feast of the Old Testament. And I did a study on drink already. So the subject that I'm at right now is the food or meat aspect. Right after which I'll head to the Sabbath. Now that being said, just before I begin, let's have a short word of prayer. Most kind and compassionate Father, as we are about to enter yet into another phase of study, I pray, Lord, that you will open the minds of my viewers so that they'll be able to understand all that is being said. In Jesus' name I pray. Okay, now let us begin. Now, from Colossians chapter 2, verses 16 to 17, it says, "Let no man judge you in meats or food," in some translations. In the book of Leviticus chapter 11 and Deuteronomy chapter 14, verses 13 to 21, God gave Israel a list of creatures that they can eat and what they should not eat. Right? Now in Colossians we see Paul saying, "One is not to judge you in meat or food, which is a shadow of things to come, but the body or substance is of Christ." Now, how was the food law a shadow of Christ? Is what I am gonna show you. At creation, man was given fruits to eat, and we find that in Genesis 1 verse 29 to 30. After Adam's sin, he was given vegetables to eat. We find that in Genesis chapter 3 verses 17 to 19. After the flood, due to all the trees and vegetation destroyed, man was now given animals to eat, of which there was no exception according to Genesis 9 verses 1 to 4. For note the every and the all mentioned in that text. Now many say the diet law was given in Leviticus 11 existed before, due to the fact that God told Noah to take 7 pairs of clean beasts and 2 pairs of unclean, right, which is found in Genesis 7 verses 1 to 5. They assume the law in Leviticus 11 was given to Noah, right? But this is clearly not so, for God did say every and all in Genesis 9 verse 4. Even though he told Noah take more of what he called clean beasts, which would suggest the Leviticus law on food existed then. But by what is said in Genesis 9 verse 14, it's clear God made no distinction in what was to eat then. It was at Sinai that God first established meat laws. And this can be proven in that, due to the fact that while God punished several nations for various sins, he has never punished any for what they eat. Read Leviticus 18 and you will see a list of things God told Israel that they should not do, of which in verses 24 to 29, God said that those things are what the other nations did, which is why God cast them out of the land. Read Leviticus 20 and you will see the same, of which in verse 22 to 27, God shows again why he dealt with other nations the way he did. It's because of those sins they committed. Also read Deuteronomy 9 verse 1 to 5, Deuteronomy 12 verse 1 to 4, and 29 to 32, Deuteronomy 18 verse 9 to 14, and Deuteronomy 20 verses 16 to 18. Notice that God never mentioned food as one of the charges he had against them. And since these nations did not fear God, we can be sure that they ate what the Jews would consider unclean beasts. Even if they knew if it's wrong, they would most certainly eat it. Even if it's a case that this law did not apply only to Jews alone, right? We can be certain that the Gentiles ate those things as well. Yet God did not punish them for the things that they eat, right? He punished Israel for those things, right? And he punished them for even Sabbath and so forth. But you never find God punishing the nations for any form of things that they are eating, right? Now that being said, but the fact that God never punished them for food is proof these laws were for Israel, which they got at Sinai. Since Noah and his family populated the earth, these nations would have all been accustomed to eating all kinds of food, which could have been passed down from Noah and his family. The same with Israel. And notice too that the chapters I mentioned, none of what is mentioned is in Colossians 2. We see mentioned as things God punished the other nations for not adhering to. Right? We never find God punishing those nations, right, for any of the things that are mentioned in Colossians chapter 2. Only Israel. And this goes to show that those things are all ritual laws and not ceremonial laws. Ritual laws that applied only to Israel. Right? And I'll read something. I'll read a few texts so that it can be you can get a better understanding of what I'm saying here. Yes, in Psalms 147 verse 19 to 20, something interesting is said here, and here's what is said concerning God. It reads, He showed his word unto Jacob, his statutes and his judgment unto Israel. He hath not dealt so with any nation, and as for his judgments, they have not known them. Praise ye the Lord. Right, so God sent his word, his statutes and his judgment to Israel. He told his word, statutes and judgment to Israel. He didn't deal so with other nations, right? And as for those statutes and judgments, they do not know them, according to what Psalms 147 verse 19 to 20 it said. But guess what? It gets more interesting than this. In the book of Romans chapter 2 verses 12 to 14. This is what is said here. For as many as have sinned without law shall also perish without law, and as many as have sinned in the law shall be judged by the law. For not the hearers of the law are just before God, but the doers of the law shall be justified. For when the Gentiles which do not have the law, right, this is backing up what is said in Psalms, do by nature the things contained in the law, these having not the law are a law unto themselves. So if they do by nature the things contained in the law, right, those if they do by nature the things contained in the law, while they do not have the law, those things become a law unto themselves. Right? And as such, they will be judged by the things of nature. This is why it says, even if they don't have the law in verse 12, right? Whosoever doesn't sin while not having law will perish without law. Right? For there is nature there to teach them, to show them right from wrong. And it goes on to say in verse 14 that if while they follow the dictates of nature and they do the things that are contained in the law, it become a law to them. So they'll be judged by that. So there are certain things that God expects the Gentile to know because nature teach them those things. Right? However, there are some things that God does not expect them to know, as nature will never tell them that they ought to do those things. And those are what we call ritual or ceremonial law. All the sanctuary services that are performed by the Levites, offerings and so forth. Nature would never tell them that, hey, you need to go out of a specific country and do those things. No, there's nothing in nature that would send you to the land of Israel to do those things. Those are all ritual laws. The same thing applies even with Sabbath. Nature would never tell you that you need to rest on the seventh day. Nature would never tell you. If somebody doesn't come to you and tell you that, let's say for argument's sake the Sabbath is to be kept, you would never know unless it is told to you. However, you will definitely know that you are not to kill, to take the life of someone. Your conscience would bother you if you end the life of someone, even if you don't know, but you don't have a written law that says thou shalt not kill. But your conscience will never bother you for working on the seventh day. It will never bother you when it comes to eating certain things, because nature doesn't tell you what to eat. You understand? Now I tell you, hey, rest on this day. Nature doesn't tell you that you must not light fire on the seventh day, or you must not go out of your place on the seventh day. Nature will not tell you those things. You understand? And this is why you find God punishing the nations for the things that I had mentioned in a few minutes earlier in this video. For nature, they would know by nature that they ought not to do these things. However, nature doesn't tell them what to eat or to even keep Sabbath. Hence, why God did not punish them regarding those things. You understand? They are all ceremonial and ritual law. Right? Now you may want to know what is the difference between ceremonial and moral law. And I'm going to read from a book, from this book here. All foods are clean and every day is the Sabbath, written by Els Thunder Lauriston. I'm certain that I've mentioned his name several times over in this video, or in my video I should say. Right? I'm going to read something from his book so that you can get an understanding. You can get an understanding as to what the difference between a ceremonial and a ritual law is. Right? This is what he says in his book regarding ceremonial and ritual laws. Ceremonial laws can be defined as the ceremonies and rituals of the Mosaic law that serve to show God's holiness and to keep Israel holy and distinct from Gentiles, which also foreshadowed Christ and his work. This definition can be corroborated with Colossians 2 verse 16 to 17, Hebrews 9 verse 9 to 10, and Hebrews 10 verse 1 to 4. Paul ends defines ceremonial law simple as that which legislated Israel worship life. Ferdinand Schenck was a bit more descriptive. The ceremonial law was taught of the holiness of God and of the coming Savior, and was designed to provide for the restored obedience to the moral law. But however one chooses to define the ceremonial law, there are certain things that the Bible student should not miss. And he mentions of three things that the Bible student should not miss. One, it is not intrinsically moral, only rituals about worship that are designed to teach holiness. Two, it contains shadows pointing to a greater reality. Three, It is temporary and can be suspended, dismissed, and sidestepped to fulfill moral obligations, and it can eventually be abrogated when it becomes meaningless or when it meets its reality. In further videos, I will explore more on the third aspect that is said, where the writer says it can be suspended, dismissed, sidestepped to fulfill a moral obligation, and it can be eventually abrogated when it becomes meaningless or when it meets its reality. I'll speak more about that perhaps when I'm touching on the Sabbath. Right? Now that's the difference between a ceremonial and a moral law. Right? Now I'm going to continue, right? And I'll read back a few things that I had read already. Right? Now, notice too that the chapters I mentioned, right? None of what is mentioned in Colossians 2 we see mentioned as things God punished the other nations for not adhering to. Those are the chapters where I showed where God punished the other nations for things that for things that they did. Right? It is this I am speaking of here, where it shows that God doesn't, the things mentioned in Colossians 2, God doesn't punish them for those things. And since they never feared God and were idolaters, we can be sure that things like the Sabbath day, they never adhered to. It was this, including food laws. It was this. If this was given as a law at creation, speaking of Sabbath now, it would have been passed down by Adam, and these nations would know they are to keep the Sabbath. And we can well assume they did not. And God never punished them nor brought a charge against them for it. Yet with Israel, we see time and time again that God stirred with Israel for not keeping the Sabbath. And this you will see when I'm dealing with the subject of the Sabbath. But I'm just using this as an illustration, right, when it comes to ceremonial and ritual laws. All this being mentioned proves that the Sabbath was not given as a law before Sinai, and the food laws never existed before Sinai either. Right? Now, how are the food laws a shadow of Christ? You might be asking. In Leviticus 11, you notice the expression, it is unclean to you. The words unclean to you is to whom the message was given. Right? Which was Israel, which we find in verse 2. Right? It is unclean to them, to Israel. It is unclean to them. Yes, in Leviticus 11 verse 4, God specifically said that it is unclean to you Israel. He was speaking to Israel as far as verse 2 of Leviticus 11 is concerned. And to Israel he says, it is unclean to you. Right? It is unclean to them, not to the world. For it's not that they are naturally unclean, according to Romans 14 verse 14, when Paul says that he know and is persuaded by the Lord that there is nothing unclean of itself. Right? Yes, Paul says he knows and is persuaded by the Lord that there is nothing unclean of itself, according to Romans 14 verse 14. Right? Nothing is unclean of itself. That's what Paul said Jesus persuaded him about, that nothing is unclean of itself. And this backs up what I'm saying in Leviticus 11. None of the things that God said is unclean were naturally unclean in and of itself. Right? They were not unclean in and of itself. Now, our God is specific. For notice in Genesis 9, with the covenant he made with Noah, he said that it was with all flesh and not just between him and Noah. Right? If that law was for everyone and those beasts were naturally unclean, then God would have just said it's unclean rather than say it's unclean to you. And let me make another point there. If Seventh-day Adventists want to argue and say that when God said that it's unclean to Israel, he wasn't speaking just to Israel alone, but to everyone, right? Then they have to argue that when God said to Noah that the covenant that he made with Noah in Genesis 9, that it is unclean, that it is between him and all the earth. They have to argue that it's possible that the covenant was not between God and all the earth, but with Noah alone. Then we have reason to fear that God may very well flood this earth again whenever we see rain is falling. You can't say that God really meant that the covenant was between him and all the earth, which he did say, and not say that God didn't mean what he said when he said it is unclean to them, to Israel. You can't take one and leave the next. It would be biased to say that God didn't mean what he mean here and say he meant what he didn't mean what he meant in Leviticus 11, but he meant what he said in Genesis 9. Right? Now, another point that I'm going to make, right, before I continue, that these laws were naturally for Israel and not for all mankind. I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you in a very simple manner that it was just exclusive to Israel. In Deuteronomy chapter 14 verses 21 it reads, "You shall not eat of anything that dieth of itself. Thou shalt give it unto the stranger that is in thy gates, that he may eat it, or thou mayest sell it unto an alien, for thou art an holy people unto the Lord thy God. Thou shalt not seed a kid in his mother's milk." Now you notice that God said the thing that dieth of itself, right? They shall not eat. But they are free to give it unto the stranger that is in their gates. That alone shows there that it was just. That is why he said it's unclean to them, right? In Leviticus 11 verse 4. Because it was just for Israel and not for everybody. It was not for everyone. Now, regarding Deuteronomy 14 verse 21, this was a law that was already stated in Leviticus chapter 11. I'm going to tell you which verse. In Leviticus chapter 11 verses 39 and 40, it says, "And if any beast of which ye may eat, right, die, he that toucheth the carcass thereof shall be unclean until evening." Any beast that die of itself, that's what it's saying there. Anybody touch it, they'll be unclean until evening. And he that eateth of the carcass, of it, shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. He also that bear the carcass of it shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. It is the same law echoed here in Deuteronomy 14 verse 21, when God says they should not eat anything that die of itself, but they can give it to the stranger. So we find two things from there. One, it was just the laws there that were given in Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14. They were just for Israel, not for everybody. Right? They were for Israel, not for everyone. Israel, not for everyone. And two, when it says unclean, it does not mean that it is unhealthy. Right? For if it is unhealthy, then we have to charge God for being wicked, for wanting to give Gentiles unhealthy things to eat, to kill them off, right? And not have his people, his own people, to eat unhealthy things. Furthermore, the Greek word for unclean there, it does not mean unhealthy. No, not Greek word. The Hebrew word for unclean there, it does not mean unhealthy. Now, the Hebrew word for unclean, right, in Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14 is, it is spelled T-A-M-E and it is pronounced Tame. It means foul in a religious sense, defiled, polluted, right, or infamous. This is what it means, foul in a religious sense. It doesn't say anything about unhealthy. It says foul in a religious sense. Now, because I know that law promoters are stubborn I know that I have to prove, give more facts, right? To say that these things, when it says unclean, it doesn't mean that they are that it's unhealthy. I'm going to show you using further simple steps that unclean here doesn't mean unhealthy. Now, reading from Deuteronomy, no, from Leviticus 11 verse 24. I'm just going to read one verse. You can read the other verses if you like. And for these ye shall be unclean. Whosoever toucheth the carcass of them shall be unclean until evening. And whosoever beareth aught of the carcass of them shall wash his clothes and shall be unclean until evening. The carcasses of every beast which divided the hoof and is not cloven eaten, nor chewed the cud, are unclean unto you. And everyone that toucheth them shall be unclean. How is it that if I touch a dead person, no, not a dead person, a dead animal, I become unhealthy? Can you touch a dead animal and actually become unhealthy? The clear answer to that is no. And it would be rather stupid and foolish to think that when God says unclean here in Leviticus 11, it means, when he says unclean, it means unhealthy. No. You're just going to make yourself look stupid. You understand? If you read the entire chapter and see the amount of things that God mentioned unclean if they do. Clearly, if you touch it or you don't do it, you're not going to be unhealthy. This is why the Greek word, the Hebrew word that I mentioned says foul. It means foul in a religious sense. It does not mean unhealthy. It means ceremonially foul then, if so be the case. And this is precisely why in Deuteronomy 14 verse 21 God said, hey, if the thing die of itself, you should not touch it. Right? You should not eat it, but you can give it to the stranger that is within thy gates. Because if it was a case that it was unhealthy, God wouldn't tell them to give it to the stranger. God is not wicked. He's not an evil God. You understand? So he wouldn't tell them to give it to the stranger. It simply means unclean in a ceremonial sense. It doesn't mean unhealthy. And the reason for this, as I've mentioned in my video, what did Jesus bring to the cross? I did state in Ephesians 2 that these laws contained in ordinances, right? These laws, commandments contained in ordinances, they cause a separation between Jews and Gentiles. Right? And this is why Christ had to take them out of the way and nail it to his cross. Right? To further prove this, that what Paul is saying was not anything already said in the Old Testament. It was said already in the Old Testament. In Deuteronomy chapter 14, God said, you are the children of the Lord your God. You shall not cut yourselves, nor make any baldness between your eyes for the dead. For you are a holy people unto the Lord thy God. And the Lord hath chosen thee to be a peculiar people unto himself above all nations that are upon the earth. So God chose them and set them apart, made them distinct from all other nations on the earth, which is something said in Ephesians chapter 2 as well. To make a distinction between God's people and the Gentiles. Right? And after God said that, he lays out in Deuteronomy 14 verse 1 to 2, the further verses he lays out the things that made them distinct from all other nations. So the purpose for them was just to make them distinct from all other nations, to separate them. Right? To separate them. Now, you can read I'm going to give you even more. Isaiah 56 verses 1 to 7. Isaiah 56 verse 1 to 7 says something interesting here. Now, this is what Isaiah 56 verses 1 to 7 says. Thus saith the Lord, keep ye judgment and do justice, for my salvation is near to come, and my righteousness to be revealed. Blessed is the man that doeth this, and the Son of Man that layeth hold on it, that keepeth the Sabbath day from polluting it, and keepeth his hand from doing any evil. Neither let the son of the stranger that hath joined himself to the Lord speak, saying, the Lord hath utterly separated me from his people. Right? Neither let the eunuch say, behold, I am a dry tree. For thus saith the Lord unto the eunuchs that keep my Sabbath, and choose the things that please me, and take hold of my covenant. Even unto them will I give in my house and within my walls a place and a name better than that, and a place and a name better than of the sons and of the daughters. I will give them an everlasting name, and that shall not be cut off. Also the sons of the stranger that join himself to the Lord, to serve him, and to love the name of the Lord, to be his servant, everyone that keepeth the Sabbath from polluting it, and taketh hold of my covenant, even them will I bring to my holy mountain, and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices shall be accepted upon my altar. For my house shall be called an house of prayer for all nations. Right? Notice, in verse 3, God said, neither let the son of the stranger who hath joined himself to the Lord speak, saying, the Lord hath utterly separated me from his people. Right? Why would God say this? That the stranger should not say this if God didn't indeed separated them from his people. If God didn't separate them from his people, they wouldn't have any need to say that in the first place. Certainly, the Gentiles, they would feel this separation based on the things that the Jews did, things that they were not acquainted with, things that had no real value or real meaning to them, right? And the things that are mentioned here in this is the Sabbath. You realize that one of the things mentioned here is Sabbath. That if they take hold of my covenant and keep my Sabbath, then they will be recognized as God's people as well. But notice, it is only when they take hold of his covenant, according to verse 4, right? That is when all the laws of Israel would apply to them. For Numbers 15 verses 16 and 29, Leviticus 24 verse 22, and Exodus 12 verse 49 says, one law shall be applied to everyone, both Israel and both to the strangers and so forth, both him that is homeborn and both to the strangers. Every law that Israel have would be applied to them. But the only time they would be applied to them is when they take hold of God's covenant. Whenever they become a part of the camp of Israel and choose to serve the God of Israel, then and only then would the laws that apply to Israel would apply to them. And so from Isaiah 56, we can understand from Isaiah 56 verse 1 to 7 why a Gentile would want to say that God has separated him from his people. For the minute you go into the land, the nation of Israel, you just feel different and out of place based on the things that they did which you are not accustomed to. And so this is a thing that would cause a Gentile to say, I am separated from God's people. And God said to them, listen, do not say that you are separated from them. For if you take hold of my covenant, right, I will give in mine house. I will give in my house and within my walls a place and a name better than of sons of daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off, right? Right? And for God says his house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations. And ironically, the Sabbath was one of the things that caused them to feel separated from God's people, which goes to show that it never applied to them. It was a law given to Israel. The Gentiles don't know anything about Sabbath. They don't know anything about those food laws and so forth. Right? And it's the same thing with these dietary laws as well. Now that being said, I'm going to continue further. I just proven a while ago that these laws, both Sabbath and those food things, were for Israel, and these were what made them distinct from the Gentiles. Right? A theme which we find both in Ephesians 2 and Colossians chapter 2. But we are not dealing with Sabbath now, I just use that as an example. Right? Now, that being said, I'm going to continue. Concerning the same foods spoken of in Deuteronomy 14 and Leviticus 11 that are said to be unclean. Now, it being unclean to them, it must mean in a ceremonial sense. Right? No, sorry, let me read that again. Now, it being unclean to them, it must mean in a ceremonial sense. If it's just unclean to them, as I've proven already, it's unclean to them, Israel, not the entire world. Right? The minute you say it's unclean to them, to Israel and not the entire world, you're essentially saying that it is a ceremonial or ritual law. And if that's the case, it must have a symbolic meaning, which we're about to see. Right? In Acts 10, Jesus gave a vision to Peter showing him some unclean animals, of which he said, "Rise, kill and eat," of which Peter refused in saying, "Nothing unclean or uncommon ever goes to his mouth." Christ, however, said to him, "What God has cleansed, he shall not call unclean or uncommon." Peter then understood that the vision was an illustration of the Gentiles, whom a Jew considered unclean to them. Remember, I just talked about the separation between Jews and Gentiles. He understood that the unclean meat was symbolic of the Gentiles, and that Christ has cleansed the Gentiles and broke the wall of separation between them and the Jews, as Ephesians 2 verse 11 to 22 states explicitly. That meat or food law, which is an ordinance, had a symbolic meaning. It represented Jews or Israel and Gentiles, with the Jew being the clean, right, and the Gentiles being the unclean, who are now made clean. That the Jews consider the Gentiles to be unclean would have been demonstrated by Christ in Matthew 15 verses 21 to 28 and Mark 7 verses 24 to 30. With a Greek woman he met and tested her faith by calling her a dog, for he was a Jew, and he knows that she knows that he's a Jew, and that Jews don't associate with Gentiles, for they think ill of them. And he knows that she knows this, so he tested her faith to see if she would get discouraged by what he said to her. Right? For note brief, testing is something God does a lot in the Old Testament. For example, Abraham and Isaac and the sacrifice spoken of in Genesis 22, right? She passed the test, as you can see. Now many will try to reason out the obvious of what is presented in Acts 10 by saying it's just a vision, so it cannot be taken literal. My answer to that is, if it can't be taken literal that the unclean animals are now cleansed, then it must follow that one cannot take it literal that the Gentiles are cleansed either. It works both ways, right? For the same vision said the Gentiles are cleansed, and that all Gentiles are yet unclean. If you're going to reason that it's just a vision and it's not literal, then you have to say that the Gentiles, the cleansing of the Gentiles is not literal. I then am still to be considered unclean, I being a Gentile, right? It would be a bad illustration to use to show that the Gentiles are made clean if the unclean animals presented are not. And if one wants to argue on that, Romans 14 should back up Acts 10 as well as 1 Timothy 4 verse 1 to 5, especially the verse that says every creature of God is good, which is what God had said in Genesis 9 verse 14, showing that God went back to his original position on foods after the flood. And last but not least, Matthew 15 verse 1 to 20 and Mark 7 verse 1 to 23, right? Those as well shows that what one eats or what one drinks does not defile us. Therefore, those dietary laws are not applicable to anyone in this day and age. Now one can argue out the obvious of what Christ said in the Gospels, that is, in Matthew 15 verse 1 to 20 and Mark 7 verse 1 to 23, that not what enters the body defiles a man, but what comes out, and argue out Acts 10, but they will never get around 1 Timothy 4 verse 1 to 5 and Romans 14, especially Romans 14. Now, the only restrictions we are given, right, is only meat offered to idols we are to abstain from, and blood, according to 1 Corinthians 8 and Acts 15 verse 29. The practice of offering meats to idols are not practiced to this day. At least I don't know of that, right? But if it is, we should abstain from it. Right? As for blood, sorry, let me repeat that. The practice of offering meats to idols are not practiced to this day. Right? At least I don't know of that. But if it is, we should abstain from it. Right? As for blood, we should not eat the blood of any animal we eat. And this is not anything strange said here, according to Genesis 9 verse 1 to 4, as this was God's original position after the flood. As for what Christ said in Matthew 15 and Mark 7, many will say that based on the context, Christ is talking about eating with unwashed hands and not clean and unclean meat, when he said, not what goes in a man defiles him, but what comes out. But even so, there are many ways he could have brought across his point without saying something that suggests that it doesn't matter what a man eats. Now Matthew 15 and Mark 7 is debatable, but as for the others I showed, it's non-debatable. I therefore conclude that one can eat what they want and should not be judged for it, as one is free to eat what they wish under this new covenant. However, while one has the freedom to eat what they want to, it's recommendable that one choose the healthiest choice of food. For while all foods are lawful to eat, not all food are expedient, advantageous, or profitable. Right? See 1 Corinthians 6 verse 12, where a principle on this is concerned. Therefore, it should be encouraged to eat healthier stuff, but not make it a law or doctrine, such as to say, if I eat this, I will lose heaven. This brings us at the end of this study on meat or foods. So yes, Colossians chapter 2 verse 16 to 17, when it says, let no man judge you in meat or in food, Paul did mean what he meant, and he meant what he meant, that we should be judged for food, right? For those laws are done away with and is not applicable to neither Jews or Gentiles anymore. I do hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like, comment where necessary, subscribe to my channel and click the bell icon so that you can receive notifications whenever I make new uploads. And last but not least, share this video with whom you know will benefit from an amazing video like this. And please stay tuned for my part 2. Bye bye now.